So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining another Sprinterra webinar. Today we're going to be talking about customization development best practices, specifically focused in Acumatica. My name's Garrett Rochelle. I'm your presenter for today. And kind of the main goal of today's session is going to be to enable you to build scalable, maintainable, and upgrade safe solutions and understand some of the ins and outs that go into making that happen. The overall life cycle for building a quality, long-lasting, customization within Acumatica is much more than just the coding. It's much more than just the prep work, and it's much more than just the follow-up. It's all of that kind of put together into one comprehensive approach. So we're going to talk through each of those pieces on today's webinar. So with that said, first thing we wanted to talk about is why this overall process requires discipline. And a lot of it comes down to Acumatica's core strength, which is being highly, highly flexible. So Acumatica by design is one of the most flexible ERPs that you're going to work with. And this is based off of Acumatica's XRP platform, which gives both developers and in many cases non-developers powerful tools to craft the system around their exact business need. However, with this flexibility, it can quickly become a risk rather than an advantage if we're not following best practices in how we roll out changes to the system, how we structure some of the custom solutions that we're putting together. And this can lead to some of the common problems that you see in the ecosystem with customizations, which is, packages that are breaking much more than they should be during an upgrade, seeing performance degrade over time, which ultimately can lead to higher maintenance costs. And one of the key thoughts here is that typically these problems can start well before development begins. And I kind of mentioned this before, and we'll go into much more depth on it, but very strong development is not going to be effective if the proper preparation doesn't go into it. And you can have very strong preparation without very strong development, and it's still, the end result is not going to be what you're looking for. So we're going to talk about the entire customization lifecycle on today's webinar, and you can see here it's broken out into 5 different stages. Each of these stages is vitally important, and you'll notice only one of these stages, which is stage 3 here, is the actual core development of the solution. There's a lot of preparation that goes into it in stages 1 and 2, which are going to be your requirements, which is where you're gaining clarity on the goals, where you're understanding the current existing process, understanding the desired outcome, the desired process, so you have a clear idea of where we're at today and where we're going. What are the pain points in the business, reasons behind the need to make this change? That all goes into that requirements gathering phase. You've got stage 2, which is your analysis and design. This is where it gets a little more technical and you start to dig into what's available out of the box to solve this problem. Maybe it makes sense to have a hybrid approach where you take some out of the box features, combine it with maybe a less intensive customization, or if it requires a full-blown customization. And all of those options are good solutions. It just depends on the request and what's going to make it be the best fit for that. In the analysis and design phase, we're also starting to put together mock-ups. You're starting to see some visual elements that help kind of tie everything together and make sure that there's a good understanding from the requester's side of what's going to be built, and then from the builder's side on what's being requested, and making sure there are no gaps there. Kind of the final output of this analysis and design phase is going to be a functional specification design document, which is going to tie all of those pieces together. It's going to tie the request, the current state, the future state, all of these designs together into one place. So there's a comprehensive document that outlines every piece of this request. From there, it moves to stage 3, which this is the core development. This is where we get into some development best practices with version control, following coding standards and that sort of thing. And we'll jump into a little more detail into that in just a little bit. You also get into stage 4, which is your quality assurance and validation phase. And this is where you can You can leverage both manual and automated testing, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, you move into your user acceptance testing and release phase. This is where the users start to get involved, start to run through the completed design, and then confirm that it's meeting their requirements, confirm that it's meeting the expectation. If any small tweaks need to be made here, that could certainly be done. And then once you get the final green light from UAT, that's where you're ultimately going to deploy it into production. So that's the overall customization lifecycle that we're going to talk through. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at stage one, which this is where we're gathering requirements. So overall goal of the requirements phase is to get clarity early and to make sure that the ask is very well understood by all parties involved. In many cases, sitting in the seat of an end user or the person that's requesting this, you have a very specific and certain perspective on the day-to-day and what is necessitating this change to be made. And this requirements gathering phase is making sure that all of that perspective, all of that understanding that are kind of supporting this overall request, making sure that's known to all parties here. So in this particular stage, we're focusing more on the business goals and less on the technical side of things. So we're not really getting the technical weeds just yet, but we're getting a good understanding of the current versus desired process. We're getting an idea of the key pain points that are driving this change, this need for change. You can start to get into some screenshots and some sample data as far as outlining the overall request that's being made. And at this point, it does make sense to use a simple requirements template that removes all of the gray area and turns the request into a very black and white, talking through what do you need, where do you need it, what's the reason behind that, what's the desired end state. Putting all of that into one document that's very cut and dried is very important. And the rule of thumb here, we've got it listed as more information early almost always saves time later. And I would say it maybe even more than almost always. If you have a development, a customization that's being built, anytime that you put in early is absolutely going to save you time in the long term. And many times it's going to be multiples. So if you're putting 2 additional times in early to ensure that the spec is ready to go, you could be saving 10, 20, 30 hours in the long run of back and forth between developer, solution design team, and the client. At this point, one thing that we do recommend is providing ballpark estimates. Oftentimes, once you go through the requirements gathering phase, you have enough information to provide a general idea of what level of effort this may take. So based off of your understanding of the initial request, you should be able to give an idea of, listen, so we're probably looking at, for example, a 50 to 80 hour customization. And this solves a couple of problems. One is it sets realistic expectations. In some cases, the requester of the customization may be anticipating that it's a very, very simple fix. And so they're thinking about a 10-hour project when you're looking at a 100-hour project, and you could spend 10 hours just putting kind of all the design documentation together just to find out it's simply not in budget. This also gives you an opportunity to validate the priority. So make sure they have budget, yes, but also make sure you have a clear idea of timeline and priority within the business. So is this something that we're going to be moving quickly on? Is this something that the expectation is it's ready within 1 month, within 6 months, all of those kinds of things. And it also gives you a chance to present alternatives. You may be able to identify right off the bat, there's 3 potential paths that we could take. Here's the ballpark estimate for path 1, ballpark estimate for path 2, and ballpark estimate for path 3. Based off of that, the client can oftentimes give you an idea of, all right, path 3, much too expensive, it's not worth it. However, path 1, it may not meet the entirety of the request, so let's go with path 2. And then you have clarity that path 2, 50 to 80 hours is approved, and you don't have to worry about putting all the time and effort into building out a design document that may ultimately not be within their realistic budget. All right, and this takes us to stage two, which is the analysis phase. So this is where you do start to get a little more technical and you start to ask some of the deeper questions. So you start to look at what version is the client on. In some cases, the version can determine what APIs are available or some of the functionality available on the UI, what's supported. You also want to start asking what version are we next going to and when's that happening? In some cases, if someone has an upgrade scheduled for 2 months down the line, you may already want to start building it on that future version. So you're getting an idea of what version they're on, what version they're going to in timeline. This is where you can do an even deeper dive into the actual delivery of this. And are there any possible ways to deliver this out of the box? Are there existing uh, GIs or reports? Are there existing workflows? Are there some existing no-code options? Or maybe it's worthwhile to consider a hybrid approach where you can satisfy 98% of the requirement using a combination of out of the box and a much lighter customization. Depending on the request and depending on the client's need, in some cases that may be a better alternative if it's going to save a significant amount of time and effort. Ultimately, this stage just allows you to dive deeper into what's going to be required and start to get into some of the documentation around putting the FSD together. So overall goal of this stage is, if possible, reduce the scope of the customization, but also lock in all of the detail so that you can ensure that moving forward, this is going to be something that is going to be able to move safely into future versions as the client upgrades over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years, and also lower the long-term costs. So at this stage of analysis, by doing an in-depth analysis and scoping out the entire project, you can ensure that you're going to build it well. You can ensure that it's going to be more easily maintainable, and you can ensure that you're not going to have to tack on additional changes down the road due to something that was missed in the scoping of this phase. So a little more detail about stage two is this is where you really want to get deep into the mockups. You want to be able to start putting together screen sketches, workflow diagrams, documenting UI behavior, writing up all the screens that are going to be impacted, what's going to be impacted on each of those screens. When we start to put all of this into a visual written requirement, like I mentioned earlier, it starts to remove all of the gray area and allows us to ensure that the expectation of the requester is aligned perfectly with the expectation of the team that's going to be delivering that solution. And that just brings us to kind of these bullet points here. How are mockups going to help us? And one, it's going to validate any assumptions that are made visually. So essentially what it's doing is it's removing assumptions and turning them into something that's been confirmed with the client. You're aligning the expectations across the team. If there are requirements that are missing, maybe there's a couple of key components that weren't considered in the initial requirements gathering session. You'll start to highlight those and figure out a plan of attack for those. And then also it reduces the rework during development. And this is where, as I mentioned before, a couple extra hours at this stage could save 10, 20, 30, or even more hours during development, because you remove a lot of the back and forth. You remove the scenario where it goes to UAT testing and the user realizes, 4 key components never made it onto the specification design document, and then you have to go back to the drawing board to put those together. So this allows you to have a very clean, locked in requirement document that you can build off of. And the ultimate output of this stage is this functional specification design document, which this is your single source of truth. And this is where all of your mockups are going to ultimately be funneled into. This is where the entire write-up is going to be funneled into. You'll have screen by screen behavior documented, any field logic and defaults that are going to be changed, workflow rules, any edge cases that need to be accounted for. And it's going to be one source of truth that can be used by developers. It can be used by the QA team. It can be used by the stakeholders on the side of the requester. It's going to be the final document that is approved and greenlit prior to moving into the actual development. And one final piece that's really important at this stage is to make sure you have a strong solution for delivery tracking. So whether you're using Jira or whether you're using Acumatica or some other solution, once you have the functional specification design document locked in, you want to make sure that the work is broken out in a structured and manageable manner. So typically you'll want to have a main ticket, which is kind of the overall request. And within this ticket, you would have it broken out into subtasks, which are going to be your implementable units of work, and then potentially even broken out into QA subtasks as well. So you would have one overall ticket for the customization itself, and then each of the core components of that customization, you would have that broken out within there as well. You'll be able to link the FSD document, any mockups, any write-ups from the client, emails back and forth, all of that you'll have in one place here in your ticket. And this is going to allow for easier long-term auditability. So traceability, going back to what was the request, what was said, when, where, and how did we end up with a certain design within the FSD. Any new team members that are being onboarded, they'll have quick and easy access to all components of the overall project. All right, and so that brings us into stage 3, where we're going to be doing the actual development of the customization. So this brings us to some of the core development best practices. So first is going to be version control from day one. And this includes having a dedicated repository for each customization with full commit history. This includes having a branching strategy in case parallel development with code reviews is going to be required. And it includes having traceable commits tied to each specific requirement within the ticket. So in general, this is going to be critical for long-term support, but more specifically, this is going to help us as we get into debugging upgrade issues down the line as the client goes from version A to B to C to D. It's going to help with knowledge transfer between either developers that we're bringing into the project or developers that are starting with us fresh, or in 2 years down the line when we're moving to another upgrade version and we need to go back and see when, why, and how a specific change was made. It's going to help with that as well. This also brings us to coding standards. So we're going to look at both .NET core principles as well as some Acumatica specific. So looking on the general .NET principles side of things, we're going to want small readable classes and methods. You're going to need to have clear naming and comments, minimal logic. So we're going to minimize the logic in screen graphs wherever we can, and then also using standard .NET coding conventions. On the Acumatica side of things, we're going to want to extend the graphs rather than overriding the core methods. We're going to want to use DAC extensions rather than modifying base DACs. You're going to perform static analysis so that we can detect performance risks prior to actually moving anything into testing or production. And also, we're going to avoid unsupported or deprecated patterns. And kind of all of this is going to work together to allow us to build something that requires less effort in the long run, less rework in the long run, and it's going to minimize the turbulence when it comes to moving through Acumatica versions in the future. And also the potential for performance degradation over time, it's going to minimize that as well. One core piece of this is going to be using automation where it makes sense. So in order for our best practices to be truly effective, they need to be repeatable so that we can do them time and time again for all variety of customizations. So these automations are going to reduce manual errors. It's gotten to the point in development where really if automation and AI to some extent is not being used, you start to fall behind the 8 ball because there are a lot of very repetitive processes that can be reduced from what may used to have taken hours and hours or potentially days and days. They can be reduced down to 2 minutes. And then this is also going to ensure consistency. So making sure that the same process is being used across all projects and all environments, where there's no one-off Band-Aid fixes that when we look back in 6 months or a year down the road that we have to figure out what in the world is going on. All right, and then this also brings us to some of the Sprinterra tooling that's currently in use. So one piece that's used daily by Sprinterra developers and is actually publicly available on Acumatica's GitHub is a solution which helps with the setup and install of local Acumatica versions for testing. So this is just an example of an automated tool that's out there that Sprinterra uses, where it's going to install the Acumatica version. So it very quickly provisions the Acumatica version that is needed for your development and testing. It automatically creates instances, and it creates them in the same manner so that you have standardized instance setup, and it eliminates any of the drift that may happen if you're creating it manually slightly differently each time. And then it also allows you to use a consistent build and deployment pipeline from dev through production. So this is an automation which handles kind of start to finish, setting up, preparing, and getting a local version in place to allow for any of your testing to happen. So the result is faster setup, fewer mistakes in configuration, and a team that's using the same process across different environments. Another example of one of the tools that's in use with the Sprinterra team is called the customization assessment tool. And this enables the Sprinterra team to catch issues early and to do it automatically. So this is a tool that runs technical checks. So it has automated scans that detect issues prior to any formal validation. It's going to generate a detailed report that highlights any specific areas of need from top to bottom within the customization. And it's going to allow you to fix these errors prior to submission. So prior to moving to production, prior to finding them in an upgrade, it assesses a customization, generates a detailed report top to bottom, and then allows you to have a very targeted approach to what needs to be resolved and in what manner. And the overall key is to reduce surprises. So when we get to an upgrade or when we get close to publish into production, there should be no surprises at that point, and that should be done with confidence. All right, and this brings us to stage 4, which is quality assurance. And realistically, this is probably the stage that most often gets overlooked or maybe doesn't have as much time dedicated to it as it should. And the important note here is that it's really not optional. So to have a truly consistent customization experience for your end clients, and to ensure that each customization that you send out is going to work today, but also going to work tomorrow, and you're set up for success in the future, there has to be a full QA team that's working on that. And that includes both manual QA, which would be execution of test cases that are taken directly from the functional specification design document, that are then stored in a test management system and that are reusable for regression testing after upgrades. It can also include an automated QA component, and this is for the customization that are expected to live through multiple upgrades, which I would hope is going to be all of them. So all of our customizations that we want to be able to go through upgrade after upgrade and do that very cleanly. You can have an automated set of test scripts set up, which would mirror your manual test cases, but it's going to bring in that automated component. This can also be used for regression testing. It can be used for upgrades as well. And this enables ongoing maintenance as associated with an upgrade to be done with confidence. So again, can't emphasize enough the importance of the QA testing and seeing many different approaches to development in Acumatica. And most often the area that has the least amount of hours or no hours is going to be QA, and that's something that leads to a lot of downstream issues that you may not see upon initial delivery, but 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line, and a year down the line, lack of QA really starts to hit home. All right, and then the final piece, the final stage is going to be UAT and release into production. So this is going to include deploying to a test environment. So this is whether it's a sandbox with a different URL or whether it's some other test site. It's going to be an environment that mirrors the production environment. It's going to allow the users to get in there and validate and test that the customization meets all of the criteria that has been requested. There's a structured feedback loop, in which case they can submit any questions or concerns back to the team. which those can then be resolved and corrected within that UAT environment. Once we get the green light from UAT, this is where it can be released into production. And it's very important at this stage that there's a clear criteria for acceptance, and there's also a very structured feedback loop where any questions that the client has, any concerns, any of the this doesn't feel quite right type of moments, that there's a very defined pathway for them to get those resolved. And then once you get to the point of giving a green light for acceptance, it should be a very clearly defined. It meets all of these criteria, and as a result, we have the green light to move forward. All right, and with that, the key takeaways from this session, and hopefully what you'll be able to remember, are going to be that customization starts well before coding, and the entire process extends well beyond as well, into QA, into UAT, and beyond. Building out that initial requirement and design is vitally important to make sure that you have a concrete document that you're working against, and to make sure that the request and the requirement doesn't shift gradually over time, so that by the time you're done building a 2-month solution, the request is still the same as it was on the first day, as opposed to some hybrid version of that request. This ultimately leads to fewer issues downstream. So if there's a clear requirement, all of this has been documented, all of this has been shared with the client, all of this has been approved. Ultimately, in the long term, there's going to be fewer issues, fewer questions, and fewer concerns. Version control and coding standards, these are two non-negotiable pieces of building a sustainable customization. The importance of QA, both manual and automated. This is going to be something that allows the end client to protect their investment, and it allows developers to ensure they're delivering a quality product. The importance of automation. This is something that's going to make your best practices sustainable and repeatable, in that it's not all about writing code. Writing code is a vital part of it, but there's really 3 core components. There's the preparation phases with requirement and design. There's the coding phase, which is very important to follow all best practices and build healthy, sustainable code. And then there's also the QA and UAT phase prior to the release to production. So the overall customization process, 3 core pieces to it, 3 core units of it, all of vital importance, and all worth dedicating the time to in order to ensure that you're delivering a sustainable customization.